right into it. Today we're going to be discussing the intersectionality of pride and cannabis, which is really, really interesting for me because they coincide so well together and everything is just layered on top of the fact that medical cannabis and of course all of the fighting for the LGBTQ plus community over 60s, 70s, 80s throughout. Of course, I'm actually sitting in San Francisco, California. So it'll be great to talk about how all these things are connected, and especially sitting in the city where a lot of these things were created and fought for. And of course, New York. And as we know, Pride was a riot. It wasn't a party. But so let's just break into it. I'll share my screen in a second. I think it'll work this time. So I am Marie Montmarquet. I'm co-founder of MD Numbers. My brother and I have been in the cannabis industry for about 15 years, plus or minus. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee, and moved to the Bay Area about 10 years ago. And our businesses are vertically integrated. We have a 50,000 square foot mixed light facility cultivation in Salinas, California, that we've had for the last 5 years. We started in delivery. We've had deliveries all over the state of California. Right now, we're, of course, in distribution for our farm and some other brand building. And I'm really involved in the social justice, social equity space for cannabis. I oversee a lot of just mentoring, and I work with success centers in San Francisco. I'm an equity advisor for a lot of the applicants that come through there. So I have a lot of just experience, of course, in cannabis, but being a lesbian, being queer, in the queer community, it's definitely interesting to see all the intersectionalities that exist, and making sure that we're all paying attention to them, I think is, of course, very, very crucial. So that would be a brief rundown, and we will share my Chrome screen. So this will be today, like I was saying, the intersectionality of pride and cannabis. Gave you guys a brief introduction of my history and why this is important to me. But of course, today we're going to go through a couple of things. One being why pride and cannabis is so connected, what it means to be intersectional in those things. One thing that's super important to me is just always reinforcing the history. Who helped shape this landscape that we are so privileged to even exist in today. I being from the South, I'm from a place where it's still not legal to grow cannabis or sell cannabis in any capacity. So being, able to do this because of the history that queer people have fought for is just unbelievable. And I have to pinch myself every day. So just talking about the past, talking about the present, talking about the future. And then, of course, we definitely always should talk about where we can improve in the space. Policy is a very important aspect of all of these things, and everything's derived from laws and policy, and then stigmas are created and they're passed through, of course, into all sorts of establishments in modern bureaucratic America. So very important to talk about policy, and being where we are today is because of two people who impacted policy greatly that were in our community. So another thing that we're going to go through, of course, is just what we can improve in the workplace, opportunities, as well as things we can improve on, and also in community. So one thing that's really, really big for me is just like, as a nutshell, how we can increase representation for all minorities in the cannabis space. If you have been paying any attention at all, there's been plenty of articles written about how small the representation is for minorities in the cannabis space. And there's numerous reasons for that, because cannabis does mimic other institutions and other industries in society today. So we cannot sit and think that this would be some sort of reinvented space, but we definitely need it to be. So also just highlight a few people that I know and love that are current change makers in the LGBTQ plus cannabis space. And then throughout this, feel free to ask any questions or make any points in the chat as we go. So before we start, I just think it's super important to define what we're talking about, right? So what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So in this, immediately when I read this, I think that cannabis and all of the LGBTQ plus community things that we fight for are so intersectional, right? We have a lot of racist systems, we have a lot of classist systems, we have a lot of gender systems that might, promote the patriarchy or whatever the current scenario is, but we definitely live in a very, very well-defined scenario where the world is a certain way because of a lot of stereotypes and a lot of stigmas. And cannabis is definitely one of those areas. And of course, being LGBTQ plus of any sort is also a very, very large area to be involved with negative stigmas. So you're putting these two things together that have traditionally been an area that are persecuted. Being LGBTQ plus, being persecuted because of that, enjoying cannabis, selling cannabis, loving cannabis, being persecuted for that. So it's very interesting to see not only are these two things so connected, but the past really has dictated why we are able to sit here today. And a lot of that is because of, or 100% of that is because of the LGBTQ plus community. So just diving into the history of why we are able to legally smoke weed. And I'm one of those people that definitely believe all cannabis is medical cannabis. I joke sometimes that even the cannabis that I'm smoking now, who knows what it might be preventing in the future. But all of these things are very, very important to keep in mind of why we're actually able to smoke cannabis, sell cannabis. It is a beautiful medicine that we have to make sure that we appreciate. So going into the LGBTQ plus, sorry, I'm tongue-tied today, community, we have a really deep history of fighting for cannabis rights. Most people should be aware of Harvey Milk, who was what was called the mayor of Castro Street. He was one of the first openly gay city commissioner in the US, and also was a city supervisor for San Francisco. And he set the tone for a lot of activism that was able to be done throughout, starting in San Francisco, but then spreading throughout across the country. During this same time, people were, of course, going through a lot of HIV and AIDS. And that was one of the main things where, of course, there wasn't pharmaceutical options. These were groups that were still marginalized from society once again. So there wasn't a lot of help for these groups. And cannabis definitely was one of the things that came into the forefront because pharmaceutical options just were not able to have any success because they weren't actually researched and created for, fighting these different things. But cannabis, Dennis Perone and a lot of others saw the effects of smoking cannabis, eating edibles, making tinctures, teas, whether it's Rick Simpson oil, now it's evolved into all different types of treatments. But Dennis Perone, who some call the father of medical cannabis, throughout the 70s and the 80s, he was growing and distributing cannabis all throughout the Castro, which is not far from where I'm sitting right now. And he was a huge figure when it comes to San Francisco passing real legislation for cannabis. So Proposition P was a resolution which was wanting we wanted the state to stop prosecuting and start permitting medical cannabis. So he was a huge part of getting Prop P passed. And that same year, a lot of people also know a very, very, very notable person, Brownie Mary and Dennis Perone worked together to open the first medical dispensary. So the San Francisco Buyers Club, a lot of people are very aware of that super, super, super amazing group of people that were the originators when it comes to healing. Healing. Cannabis is a medicine. We, as the queer community, we were in need of a lot of things at that time. And these were two individuals that really stepped up and made sure that access was first. And no matter the stigma, you were able to have access to these things, whether it was for cancer, for AIDS. The San Francisco's Buyer Club was a treatment center. If you were very ill, they would bring you in, they would take care of you. And it's one of the things that always drew me to wanting to be involved in cannabis today, was a lot of the compassion care programs and a lot of the initiatives that these individuals started years and years ago. So tons, like notable people can go on, but Brownie Mary was huge. Harvey Milk was huge. Dennis Perone was huge. We would not be sitting here without those people. And these are definitely people that I can speak to, where you say, you speak about raids and people that have been shut down time and time again. Oaksterdam University being one that comes to mind. They were raided multiple times, yet would still come back and reopen and re-support the community and make sure that they were able to do exactly what they wanted to do. Not what was legal at the time, but what they knew was right at the time. And I think that's one huge thing that sets, queer activism apart from a lot of activism, and intersectionality layers that with, the things that we fight for as LGBTQ plus people and cannabis, because we are fighting for what we know is right, not necessarily what the law says is right. And that's something really, really big that cannabis, for me, I've always been able to be in a circle of individuals that were free thinkers. And of course, in our community, the LGBTQ plus community, we are also free thinkers. And these things definitely align in a lot of ways. So just a space centered on broader communities and inclusion is naturally something that comes with, us just being a part of our community. So we'll talk now about some evolution. So we just went through a lot of the past, that things that have been going on. I mean, we would literally not be sitting here today if it were not for LGBTQ plus rights. They led the way for medical cannabis regulation in California. And without any of those things happening, we would not be here today. So today, now 36 states and counting have passed pro-cannabis legislation, which is huge. More than a majority of the United States. And every year, more and more bills, more and more states are trying to pass adult use and or medical cannabis. Currently, right now, one thing that is huge and kind of heavy on the entire cannabis community, in my personal opinion, is 40,000 people are currently incarcerated for cannabis. So every day we've got a lot of corporate companies that are seizing the day, and a lot of maybe Canadian companies that are coming in, going public. We've got a ton of money being made on the corporate side, and the 1% of definitely is appreciating that, but turning a blind eye to the currently incarcerated individuals and making sure to, like, one thing that I believe in is also expungement, but not necessarily expungement, but making it as easy to expunge as possible. So expungement clinics, making sure that we can get the 40,000 currently incarcerated for cannabis out of, jail and prison right now is huge. That's just ridiculous. And for me to be able to make money in cannabis, meanwhile, people that are literally, like, I'm from Nashville, are in Nashville, Tennessee, sitting behind, jail cells because they're unable to have, the opportunity to do what I'm doing merely because of racist policies. So that, for me, is just a huge piece that we all need to pay a lot more attention to and focus our political attention to, and try to make sure that we can release these people. Science versus legislation. Hello, right? Another thing that the queer community understands a lot of is, there's tons of studies that prove time and time and time again how this particular plant impacts people in a positive way. Yet our legislation continues to persecute and criminalize in a lot of ways until, like I said, there's 36 states that have, but there's still a lot of cities and a lot of places you go and you're extremely persecuted for smoking cannabis, selling cannabis. We need to make sure that we don't just support rescheduling cannabis. We only support decriminalizing cannabis because it's less harmful than alcohol. It's less harmful than a lot of the things that you can get over the counter. And just being able to be in a common sense mindset when you're thinking about these things, because this is literally where we are today. So we've fought and we've definitely got a ridiculous amount of things accomplished. And now we're sitting here and we should make sure that we can accomplish a lot more in the fashion that Dennis Barone and others would have wanted before we allow corporate America to run away with cannabis, right? So opportunities, there's a lot of opportunities out there. The freeing of the 40,000, there's a group that I work with that Corvain Cooper is a guy that just recently was clemency through Trump, of all people. And he was just let out. He had a lifetime conviction for a non-cannabis crime, and they're working to free the 40,000. So just making sure that there are more opportunities to bring these issues to the forefront and do something about them. For me, something that I care deeply about are equity programs. Again, this would be making sure that those that have been greatly impacted by the war on drugs have a huge opportunity to participate in this industry, and not just, saying that we're going to let them participate, but actually giving them real tangible solutions, access to real estate, access to capital, creating programs that are funded for them, once again, before we give cannabis away to corporate America. Opportunities still today, right? I talk to a lot of people that really support cannabis and really feel good about cannabis, and they know cannabis is a really positive situation, but maybe they're a mom and they're very concerned about smoking cannabis and being a mom that is labeled as a cannabis smoking mom, or minorities in that same sense where, that you're going to be potentially dealt a different deal throughout this process than some other fair skin tones, whether it's an equity program or whether it's, just smoking in your apartment. San Francisco had to fight recently against a bill that was going to ban smoking in all multi-dwelling units. So if you can imagine, that means you have to own a home in San Francisco in order to smoke weed in your house. That's insane, especially considering the average household, average house cost in San Francisco could be 1.2 million for a 2-bedroom. Just making sure that we're very aware of who we're giving this plant to. It can't just be for the wealthy. Can't just smoke weed if you're rich and you can enjoy having, a house that is detached from all others. This is just very relevant in, what's going on today. Compassion care programs is another really, really, really important thing that, once again, Dennis Barone and others were huge on. Being able to donate product for those that can't afford product. There was a lot of dispensaries back in the day. Harborside was one. Everybody knew if you walked in there and you were terminally ill or you were, you just were underserved, they would service you. They would take care of you. And making sure that modern day cannabis currently, there is no understanding for the fact that we as cannabis connoisseurs are compassionate first people. We didn't come in this to, not be able to do what we love and give people cannabis and terminally ill people cannabis. There's a lot of people who have personal relationships with its families, have been able to have a better quality of life for a lot longer because they had access to cannabis. And a lot of times it was at cost or it was free. It's not all about making money on every little turn, but Prop 64 came and the taxation went so high that it really changed the culture so fast of what we're doing right now in legal cannabis that we all should be very aware. Because once again, these are not the programs that that Dennis Barone would have wanted to support a completely for-profit model of, taxation, and then giving all the tax dollars to the police so they can then come and police us even more. It doesn't really make sense. So more opportunities, federal research bills, that is super, super, super important to me. We all have a lot of our own anecdotal experience with cannabis and why it's effective in certain ways, but it's beautiful to have research, right? It's beautiful to have peer-reviewed studies that can back this up, but on a federal level, on a state level, not necessarily on an independent level, so that we can actually get more funding towards research. Because I believe that will be one of the key factors that opens up a lot more of the actual, we know what we know, but we don't know it necessarily because it's been researched over and over and over in any federal capacity, which would be beautiful if we could actually have a lot more federal research. And they are passing that right now, because the medical community, this was said from one of the senators, the medical community agrees that we need more research to learn about marijuana's potential health benefits. But if our federal laws today are standing in the way of that inquiry, and the group's bill will remove excessive, in this bill, what they want to do is remove excessive barriers that will make it difficult for researchers to study the effectiveness and safety of cannabis and hopefully give patients more treatment options. So it's just very good to see that a lot of people understand that we not only do we need to service the poor and service the sick and make sure that we keep empathy, but we need to make sure that there are more research along with compassionate care programs. Moving on. Yeah, scheduled one is terrible. I'm just looking in the chat. Hello, you're right. Totally right. I do not support any scheduled one. I don't support anything but descheduling, just because it's like a half win. We want the full win. We want the full truth, right? We don't want to live in a fake truth. Another thing that we've seen right now, which would be like needs for opportunities for small business support. Once again, with Prop 64 coming so rapidly and taking over Prop 215 in California, Prop 215 really supported a robust small business, like a lot of small businesses. And when Prop 64 came, the barriers for entry were so high, and the cost of all the new permitting and going through planning and building and exercising all of the different things for compliance that the city and the state would want you to do, it eliminated a lot of small businesses just because there was no support for these legacy operators to roll into 64 from 215. So there's huge opportunities to have a lot more small business support than what we currently have. But once again, successes, just literally being here, sitting here, understanding the things that, these two men and all the women that were around them as well to create Alice B and just everyone. It's very, 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 very breathtaking in some ways to just see man, we've definitely come very far in a very short amount of time, and considering of a lot of other things that America has been fighting for. So the current legal landscape is definitely in a very positive position. And, we would not be having this conversation again without the activism from LGBTQ+. We are literally the people that made this happen. It doesn't necessarily just overlap. It is the foundation of us being able to have modern cannabis today. So making sure that these things are talked about is very crucial. Moving on to the future. Federal, state, local legislation. That's where we are right now, of course. These are the things that are happening. So one question that I have for all of us that are just here thinking about all these intersectionalities and making sure that we literally are living by the legacies of our mentors that have created this for us. But how do we ensure that those that have fought to free cannabis from criminalization, over these last 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 30 years, 20 years, however long, and the communities that have been over-policed by this drug war, how do we make sure that they have an equitable opportunity to participate in compliant cannabis? That's one thing that I think about a lot. How can we make sure programs are funded in ways that are not predatory, which right now we have a very contradictory program where we want to give licensure to people that have no money, but we don't bring in money, and the corporations that come in and offer deals, they are, not necessarily here for supporting these same social justice initiatives. They just are interested in being able to open up a business and sell that business as fast as possible. So, making sure that we have these conversations is so crucial. And what can we do to have more equitable opportunities? And right now, me being in California, where a lot of things are already, the ball's already started rolling, but the ball hasn't even started rolling in a lot of cities, in a lot of states. So speaking about this now is just super important to get ahead of what would be new legislation in a lot of cities, and making sure that the people that are currently participating, the people that have brought this cannabis from criminalization and were willing to be criminalized, have the opportunity to participate. Priority processing is another thing that hopefully we'll be able to do in some forms of legislation in more tangible ways, but making sure, if you were someone that could prove potentially that you were selling weed in Texas, let's say right now, when Texas does permit, how would you be able to then be fast-tracked or grandfathered in, or what would they be able to do for you should be thought about now, so everything doesn't just go to, corporate cannabis again. I again just harp on this over and over again, because this is why we're here. Again, not just here literally today, but why I'm able to, profit from selling cannabis is these individuals that have come before us, Prone and Milk, and just making sure that we're creating policy that reflects the visions of those individuals. I believe we have gotten so far from that, that it's truly not relevant to the people that are creating this policy at this point, which is the saddest thing. But getting enough information to the right people to recreate some modeling that diverts all the profits from the government's dollars, the general fund, back into the community once again, and including some sort of anti-profiteering models, which would be why, once again, these things were created. It's literally a plant to heal people. It's not something that we should be sitting here trying to gouge at every tax incentive. And if you do the math, I don't have the exact numbers, but I mean, cannabis has an average of a 70% tax rate, which is the highest tax rate of anything in current America. So making sure that we just can come up with some better policies and ways to reinvest this money and reinvest in small businesses is very, very important. Compassionate care programs, not only at the local level, not only at the state level, but at the federal level. A lot of these things, of course, need to be affected at the federal level, and making sure that the federal government is very aware of equity programs, making sure legacy operators have the chance to continue to operate, compassionate care programs that are insured by normal insurance. Imagine that, being able to get your cannabis for your same copay as your other pharmaceutical drugs, and potentially wean yourself more and more, of course, off of those drugs onto something natural. So we're pretty far away from that, I would say, but this is something that definitely needs to be, in the ether. Community reinvestment, once again, can't harp on that enough, but there's also community benefit agreements that a lot of these cities have with their cannabis operators, and making sure that these are accountable. That's another really big piece. If a city offered, we're going to open up 10 storefronts in this city, and those 10 storefronts guaranteed that they were going to donate money to the youth, they were going to sponsor the softball team, they were going to come into other programs and create new after school programs or whatever the case may be. What's currently happening is the state is so bogged down and so many things are going on that they are not even holding these cannabis licenses to the same accountability as any other industry for the most part. And regardless of other industries, they're not being held accountable in cannabis. So we really need to not only look at what's being promised, but how accountable are these people to what they are promising us, especially when community reinvestment is the whole point of this, making sure that we're taking these funds and putting them back into our communities and not just giving them to the police, and making sure that they're going into things that are going to reduce the strain of all of these ill effects of the past, right? So this is what is currently the future. Well, this is what the future could look like, or topics especially that will be discussed and hopefully be important, especially as we talk about federal legalization. So that to me is another really, really, really big piece of all of this. And the last bill that went through, they actually had a piece in there that removed equity licensures. It said that if you had a felony or some sort of previous conviction for cannabis, that you would not be able to have a license. So making sure that, not only are we supporting the bills that we want and creating the bills that we want, but we can't be so interested in what the federal government is passing as much as we want it to be right. So making sure that they are set up to support all of these programs, which we know the federal government normally doesn't want to support. So making sure that they understand that, cannabis is not going to be just the next cash crop of all sorts. We need to look at it and make sure it's looked at as a plant that is healing people, and everyone that has an ailment and the need has access to this plant. So bam, evolution part 3. Reinvestment of cannabis tax funds back into communities. So this is something, of course, going through everything that we've gone through the last, our entire lifetimes. But if we look at just everything that's gone on the last year and a half, when we're talking about investment back into communities, 3 areas listed here, but there's, so many areas. But first things first, those that were negatively impacted by the war on drugs obviously need help. Economically deprived, medically underserviced. These are the areas that this money should be going to. These are the things that have obviously been the most detrimental, had the most detrimental effects from the war on drugs, the racist policies that go into communities. They're arresting people at ridiculously higher levels than anywhere else. And then when cannabis is finally legalized, what are we going to do for these groups? Nothing, something. So we must do something, of course. But we have to make sure that the cannabis tax funds, me, of course, I would like to do something, but we have to make sure that the people that are writing these policies in all of these new cities, these states that are coming online, amending policies that are already written, whether it's in California or Colorado or anywhere else. But we really, really need to make sure that these cannabis tax dollars are going back into the community. One thing that kept me personally from voting for Prop 64, I did not vote yes for it, was that all the money went to the general fund. So if all the money is going to the general fund, then this is a joke. We know where the general fund money goes. That goes to padding politicians' pockets all throughout this corrupt game that we play here. So if they were not going to earmark these funds to go to homelessness, to go to youth, to go to anything, any earmarking of any sort that would have been for community reinvestment of any sort, but instead taking every single dollar and putting it into the general fund, joke of all. We're going to take the largest economy of cannabis and literally pad politician pockets with it. We're going to do nothing good. So that was one thing about Prop 64 that I just thought was a very, very, very obvious blow to everything that we've been trying to accomplish here. And even in Colorado, I believe all of the initial funds went in Colorado to homelessness. And if you look at what the homelessness rates were prior to them doing that, they almost ended homelessness in Colorado with cannabis dollars. California, not so much. Next thing, so establishing more ways to promote diversity. One other thing that is why we're all here, of course, in cannabis, it's just beautiful to see like as much diversity as we can, because that's, of course, is who's smoking this plant. It's very diverse, but we want to make sure that these groups are represented, right? Like, it's so expensive to get a cannabis license. The barriers for entry are so high. Like, how can we make sure that more people that are marginalized, that's literally and always the marginalized communities of all sorts, just do not have access to real estate. They don't have access to capital. They don't have, can't call mom and dad for a quick million like a lot of these other specific groups can that have ran into cannabis and make it look very easy. So like, what can we do to promote diversity? How can we make sure that more marginalized communities are involved in cannabis? And then in overall fashion, treating cannabis similar to other commoditized industries. Because we are still Scheduled I, drug, banks don't touch us, a lot of different ways. Real estate's far more, insurance is far more, anything, you name it, it's, triple, 4 or 5 times the price. If somebody can gouge, they will overly gouge because this is cannabis. And that's even more detrimental to making sure that those that are like us and minorities that are impacted by the war on drugs are allowed to participate or can participate, when we know that this industry is just so absorbently, all the costs are just extremely absorbent than any normal industry. Bam. Oh man, mental health. That would have been insane. Imagine if California would have given some money to mental health and homelessness instead of the general fund. Night and day, Heather. Like night and day. So going on, could talk about this forever. I think I only have 1 minute left, so let me hurry up. Bam. So cannabis and pride, social tolerance. That's one thing that I think of in all of this. Like, we are the connection to openness. We are actually able to live our truth. We're able to be free, whether that's in cannabis alone, the LGBTQ plus community alone, but together they are so relevant. Just making sure that we're creating spaces for proper patient care and access because of all the things that we've done in the past. Opportunities and challenges, of course, self-expression, lack of inclusive healthcare is another thing that's big. I would say is a workplace issue and broad. Policy, of course, we're still dealing with a lot of adoption rights, gay marriage rights, equal opportunity workplaces, sexual orientation, workplace protections, which is huge still currently in the US. Opportunities in the community settings, of course, just making sure that we all have a safe space and grassroots initiatives. We've already gone through this a little bit, but making sure we can have a path or a vision for a more equitable cannabis space. We're the 99% versus the 1%. And cannabis is just a small example of large scale economics right now. These are 3 superstars that I know and that I love. Felicia Carbajal, Joyce Canale, Andrea Brooks, all 3 people that I have met in California and are extremely influential in making sure that they speak through the voice of inclusion, and they're all in our community and people that I look up to and work with. And Felicia specifically, if you're in LA and you're looking to get involved, or even if you're not in LA, it doesn't matter. If you're looking to get involved in expungement clinics, or if you're looking at anything as far as organizing grassroots with no BS from the top down, bottom up, call Felicia. She is amazing. Her groups are amazing, and they're just people that have impacted my life greatly. So I could talk about this forever. but I think that I'm not supposed to keep going right now. But I'm gonna just look at some more of these comments and respond in the chat, and leave my information in the chat as well. All right, I just dropped my info in the chat, and definitely reach out. I love all the different states represented. This is amazing. The more we can do to get ahead of it, get ahead of this ball that is rolling.